So yeah, before I begin, I guess I just would like to acknowledge the tradition and custodianship of the law of country on the various campuses at University of Sydney Stand, and also the various farms that we have as well, and pay respects to those that have cared and continue to care for country. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the country of the Darug and Gundungurra people in the Blue Mountains today, where I'm talking from, and also somewhere some of this research is happening that I'll talk about today, and the Waggamunkala people in the Simpson Desert as well, where we've done quite a bit of work over the years, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. So yeah, following on from the kind introduction, I'm an ecologist, a field ecologist by training, that also has a love of data as well, and really interested in how different disturbance events affect everything from individual species to communities, all the way up to ecosystems, in this sort of backdrop of rapid environmental change that we're experiencing. Started off doing a lot of work in arid Australia, which is a fascinating environment, which is highly variable environment and always keeps you guessing, and sort of moving into more coastal forest environments and agricultural environments over the last few years too. And because some of these questions are quite broad, I like to borrow techniques from data science, new technologies, particularly around remotely sensing our wildlife. And because we can't be everywhere at the same time, citizen science is sort of showing more of an important role now in really helping us understand broad scale changes across the landscape. So today I'll just sort of give a bit of a background, I guess, of where I'm coming from, and I launch into some examples of something at the population level, the Kawari, which most people probably haven't heard of before, but by the end of the talk, you'll know to love them. I'll give an example of an ecological process, and this is going to be from Wildfire from the Simpson Desert. And then build into looking at how ecosystems sort of work in the Simpson Desert, and how disturbance can permeate through that system and change species interactions in the backdrop of climate change, at least for the components that we've measured. And then the second part of the seminar, I wanted really to move on to the different research programs that started up since 2019, moving into agriculture and post-fire recovery. And I won't be able to mention them all, but also work around citizen science, and even starting to dabble in a bit of disease ecology as well. So we're facing this biodiversity crisis at the moment, where our extinction rates, particularly for vertebrates, are twice that of what the background rate should be. And things are looking pretty dire. And so we might go and face this challenge by saying, oh, well, let's try and prioritize our resources. Let's look at what threats are out there and rank them. How many species do we have, and how many threats do each face? And then, you could say that if a species got more threats, it's probably under more of an extinction risk. But when we did a bit of an analysis of that, it turned out that there wasn't really any relationship between the number of threats that a species faced and its extinction risk, which was a bit of a surprise. But also, I guess, it showed us that there are no shortcuts here when it comes to working out how our environment works, and that we need to really sort of concentrate on each component one by one, and start to keep field ecology alive and collect that data on individual species. Growing out of this biodiversity crisis at the species level, there's increasing concerns now that ecosystems are at risk of collapse, and our whole ecosystems are assessed under both national and IUCN guidelines to assess the risk of collapse. And you've probably heard about the Great Barrier Reef and the multiple coral bleaching events that have occurred, and it's really putting that system under great stress. But it's not all unique, and there are other ecosystems in Australia and around the world that are also not looking too good. So there's a need to look at processes across a range of different scales from species levels to ecosystem levels. And it also keeps things interesting. So if you were to go out now, even trying to get into work nowadays, it seems, if you go for bushwalk or want to go out, do a bit of field ecology, chances are you're going to be impacted by an extreme weather event a lot greater now than what it was, say, post 2005 in this particular analysis that we did. And this was actually trying to tie things to how different ecosystems were changing across Australia. But for me, some of the more practical things about this is it's just becoming harder. It's becoming harder to travel. It's becoming harder to get out there anymore. So this has implications in how we collect data as well. So switching to our first example, coming from a population level, let's talk about the Kowari. So this is the Kowari here. It's about the size of a rat, but it's a dasyurid, so it's a carnivorous marsupial. So it's related to like the Tasmanian devil and now extinct thylacine. It is a pretty amazing creature. If you think about, it's the size of a rat, the next mammalian predator in this system is the dingo, which is a pretty big jump in the size class there. Anything in between is now extinct. The Koaris occur in the Gibber deserts, the stony deserts across South Australia up into the Channel Country of Queensland. And there's a few remnant populations just sort of south of Birdsville up into the Channel Country. If they are anything like some of their cousins, like the Mulgara, which is similar sized species, but it occurs on the Sandhill deserts, they could be quite important for structuring ecosystems as well. So for the Mulgara, for example, when it's present in a system, it also helps promote diversity of other smaller dasyurids in that system. So it's a bit of a keystone species. So if the Mulgara is acting in a similar sort of way in this particular desert, then it's quite an important thing to conserve. Unfortunately, it's listed as vulnerable. And so this launched a project with the South Australian government on this, I think, quite amazing creature. So what we did, we looked at about 15 years worth of live trapping data from South Australia that Rob Brandle and colleagues have been collecting. We looked at sort of key habitat associations. What we wanted to know is, these species are declining. Is the habitat quality declining? Is that the reason why? Is the body in reproductive condition? Is it responding to rainfall events like you would expect in our Australia? Or is there some mismatch going on there with reproduction? We also then wanted to look more broadly at the population dynamics of the species. We've got a couple of populations that have been monitored. So we wanted to know, do these populations act in synchrony? Do they have the same dynamics as each other? Or do they do things completely differently? And the dasyurids are known to dance to their own beat. And then we wanted to also update and try and forecast the extinction risk based on our population dynamics model. So what's been done is there are two Elliott trap grids that are set out in South Australia, just south of Birdsville. An Elliott trap is this metal box at the bottom here. It's a live trap. You put a bait in there, the animal goes about its business during the night, goes, oh, there's something tasty, runs into the bait to eat it. There's a treadle in there, which then the door slams shut and it can't get back out. And then you come along early in the morning, take the animal out, take all the measurements that you want. And here's a quarry being released back onto the Gibber Plains. You can see there's not much there. And so this has been going on since 2000, and this particular data set goes up to 2015. Also, when they're out there, they're doing sort of habitat variables, collecting information about where they're bound, where their burrows are built and things like that. So when we looked at these two different trapping grids, and ran some population dynamic models. In this case, we used some multivariate autoregressive state space models. We found that these two particular potential populations or subpopulations were acting in synchrony. They were all both going up and down at the same time. And this is actually quite similar to its cousin, the mulgari, I mentioned earlier. However, the growth rate, even though highly variable, which is what you would expect from an arid zone species, it was still negative, and we were still seeing this sort of gradual decline in the projected numbers over time. So we had a look at male and female body condition, and this is an old school technique where it's basically linear regressions, look at the residuals. If the residuals different to 0, you can kind of see which year is pulling out to be a bit different than the others. Likewise, we did that for a testis condition. And then really the moral of the story here is that we didn't find any real patterns going on here. There wasn't really any evidence that there was a decline in body condition or anything like that, or testis condition in the males. It was pretty variable, no real patterns. When we had a look at the females, and we looked at the females basically if they had pouch young or not, they seem to be still breeding and responding to rainfall events. So these little pie charts that are running across the top of the figure on the bottom right, the gray area is basically the proportion of females that were captured that had pouch young. And so there were spurts of breeding going on in response to, they're fairly infrequent but important rainfall events that occur out in arid Australia. So they seem to be in fairly, good condition. No real declines there. They seem to be still breeding and responding to rainfall events. So intrinsically, something within the population seemed to be working all right, but their young weren't really surviving, I guess. There's something external going on. So and that's a bit unknown, but maybe it's introduced predators or something like that. We then ran our growth rate and ran it through our models again and did some simulations to try and forecast what is our extinction risk now. And we borrowed the IUCN Red List criteria here to do this. So at the moment, they're vulnerable to extinction, which basically means that there's a 10% chance of a extinction event over the next 100 years. So the bottom right graph where it has vulnerable, that dashed red line is basically our threshold set by the IUCN. And when our black line, plus or minus some credible intervals that are dashed lines here, when our black line sort of hits that red threshold, that's when they sort of meet the IUCN's definition. And I should sort of point out too that we were pretty conservative on how we defined an extinction event here too. We basically said it was a probability of a 99% population decline, which is pretty as strict as we could make it, really. But you could argue that a 90% decline would be enough to pretty much functionally end that species. So anyway, moving up the charts, to be listed as endangered by the IUCN and by our national legislations as well, the definition there was a 20% chance of extinction within 20 years. And unfortunately, the Kauai hit and met this threshold within the 20-year period. For critically endangered, it's even more drastic. So it's 50% chance of extinction within 10 years, but it didn't meet that criteria. Good. So at least for these populations in South Australia, there seems to be some evidence that they're actually endangered now. And what of other populations that are going on? There's not many other populations out there. There's some in Western Queensland in the Channel Country. And if they are performing with the same dynamics of the South Australian populations, which is quite possible given the synchronized dynamics that are coming out, all these populations might be declining as a consequence. So this has spawned William's PhD project, who's been over the last few years investigating this into greater detail in between lockdowns and extreme weather events. And he's going to try and drill down a bit more to some of the finer scale dynamics. It also spawns this new initiative called Team Kuari, which is basically to raise awareness of the Kuari, to bring in people that might want to help out. So we've got people that donate artwork and things like that, and also to raise some funds to keep the work going for this little fella. And hopefully the Kuari will pop up soon in the Mammal of the Year competition that's been run at the moment. So put your votes in for the Kuari, I reckon. So moving on to an example of an ecological process now, I wanted to talk about wildfire, in this case in the Simpson Desert. And it's an interesting place to talk about wildfire because it's a little bit different to the coast. So just as a background, the Simpson Desert, unlike the Giba Plain Desert that you saw earlier, is a sand dune desert, or at least where we work. It pretty much looks like this photo that was taken from the air, where you've got these rolling dunes, on average separated by about 1 kilometre. They can get up to about 10 metres high, sometimes 20 in extreme places. And this system is dominated by spinifex grassland, which are sort of little grey clumps on the dunes. So we're now taking you to southwestern Queensland, just on the border of Queensland and the Northern Territory. And when Sturt first climbed up his first sand dune to get into the Simpson Desert, he got to the top and then just saw this outlook of dunes for hundreds of kilometres. And I think he described it as, I just entered the fiery pits of hell, which is, it's actually quite a really interesting place to study. So with wildfire, when we looked at, basically we had a look at some satellite records and worked out the area that each wildfire burnt since about the 1975 onwards. And mapped all the fire scars, worked out the area, and then we were able to predict the area burnt based on the last sort of 2 years of cumulative rainfall before a fire event occurred. It was positively basically related to these big rainfall events. If it rained that year, then it was less likely to burn. And it was also related to the Southern Oscillation Index, which is, I guess, another way of predicting rainfall. And this photo here is from the 2011-2012 fire season. And these fires are huge. So we just looked across these sort of 3 properties here, which are about an 8,000 square kilometre area, our study area. And yeah, up to 70 to 80% of a property can burn in one of these big fire events too. So it's sort of the origins of the megafire you can look to arid Australia. And what's interesting about these fires is that we found that when we're looking at sort of the return intervals, they're around 21 years before the same patch would burn again. So what would happen is a fire would come through. Then the next fire, when it came through, it would burn within an area that escaped the previous fire, and then it would just layer itself in this sort of massive mosaic almost. And then after 21 years, the same patch was able to burn again. These fires are really hot. Spinifex burns very hot. You can boil your kettle really quickly on a spinifex clump. And here's a photo from the 2011-2012 fire season where we had to retreat back to the nearest homestead as the fire ripped up. We're over in this region here, watching the fire burn down here from the homestead. So they're quite fierce when they get a run on. So what happens in this system is you basically end up with around a 90 percentile rainfall event. So basically there's 2 years cumulative rainfall will promote enough fuel load for a fire to occur. And then what sparks these fires are dry lightning strikes caused by the summer storms at the end of end of basically a boom phase in arid Australia, at least for this region. And so you'll get these lightning strikes that will then start these big fire events as a consequence. And here's an example of a couple of lightning strikes here. And again, same fire season. And the next morning, there were little puffs of smoke coming up from this general direction. So fire is interesting in that you've got to add water for it to burn in this arid system. Whereas on the coast, you're waiting for a drought to occur, and then it's more likely to burn. So these big rainfall events, they trigger all these different processes in arid Australia in quite opposite directions to what can happen on the coast, which is kind of interesting. But arid Australia, it's not immune to climate change either. And so we had a look at all the bureaus, all the bomb records from all the stations surrounding the Simpson Desert, and try to get records as far back as we could. And just with quantile regressions, we had a look at the changes in temperature and rainfall over the last 100 odd years. And I've pulled out Bowyer and Glen Ormiston as examples here, because they're kind of good examples of what was going on and what we found. And basically, this region is getting hotter, which is in line with what we've expected with the way we've neglected addressing climate change. And in this camp, we'll look at this figure over here. We're looking at minimum temperatures. The top line is the 95th quantile, then we've got the 90th, then we've got the 50th or medium, and then we've got the bottom extremes, the 10th and the 5th. And basically, for temperature, particularly minimum temperature, it was getting hotter based on the median, but also in the extreme ends as well. So the nights are getting warmer, the winters are getting warmer, and the hotter days are getting hotter. Rainfall was a little bit more of a variable story. And Glen Ormiston showed a kind of a really interesting pattern here that's worth pulling out. So in this case, the extreme, some 95th quantile was significant. So that magnitude of these extreme rainfall events has been increasing over the last 100 odd years. And then also when we looked at the return intervals of these big rainfall events, we found that they're actually decreasing too. So we're getting this increase in these massive rainfall events, and they're starting to become a bit more frequent than what our records have shown. So this has real consequences then for our fire regime as well, because if fire is driven by our rainfall and those big rainfall events, we could expect then a whole change in the whole rainfall our fire regime as a consequence. Not to mention it's getting hotter too, so the fires could be even more severe. So then moving to ecosystems and how an ecosystem might respond and all this sort of change that's going on. Again, we'll continue with our example of the Simpson Desert. So I've kind of been mentioning loosely what booms and things like that. Arid Australia is a really boom bust system. The status quo usually is it runs around in a bust, which we kind of know as drought. Then there'll be this big resource pulse, which is generally driven by about the 90th to the 95th quantile in rainfall event. So it usually works out to be double the annual rainfall that'll fall across summer usually. It's about the 400 mils, things start to really, really happen. Things will boom, big increase in productivity, vegetation growth and seed and animals that follow. You get the spectacular flocks of budgies flying past, which can contain thousands of individuals. It's quite an amazing time. Then it starts to dry out and we enter this decline phase where the food starts to run out and our populations start to decline or even crash. And then we go back into a bust phase, back to our status quo again. And then you'll get these blips. And it used to be maybe every 10 years you might get these big rainfall events, but seems to be more frequent nowadays. And just a little bit of a side note on some of the data that I'll be showing you is how we collect it, particularly for the vertebrate data, is we use these pitfall traps. This is an example of a photograph of a pitfall trap. And basically, it's a fancy hole in the ground. In the middle here, there's a stormwater pipe. And either side, there's some drift net. Animal runs along, hits the fence, hopefully runs the right direction, and then falls down the hole. And then we come back next morning, pull the animals out, take all the measurements we need, and we calculate our population estimates and things like that from this data set. And here's an example of some quite healthy spinifex. This is after the 2000 rains, which was quite a big year. This photo was taken. So looking at the components of the system that we've actually been able to survey, and putting them all together to see how these dynamics might work. So what I'll do is we built this ecosystem model based on sort of our prior knowledge of how the different species will interact with one another. And we gradually built it up sort of from first principles. What I'll do is I'll focus on what's in the black outline because there's quite a lot that goes on here. And then we employed the structural equation modeling technique to then test our drivers and how they interact with our sort of lower trophic orders, and then how that permeates up through the different levels in our trophic levels here. And in particular, I'll just focus on what's happening in black. But basically, we've talked about fire. So we had a year since a wildfire variable in here. And the longer it had been since the fire came through, basically the bigger the spinifex clump would be. Spinifex clump, the size is basically also related to how much rainfall had fallen as well. The bigger the plant, the more capacity it has to produce seed. So we had this positive relationship with the bigger the plant, the more seed could be produced. Spinifex seed's a major food source for our rodents and for pretty much anything that eats seeds out in the desert because it's such a dominant plant. So we did see a positive relationship, more seed, more rodents in this case. Rodents are basically kind of the prey base for the system. We don't have many rabbits, if at all, although that could change. And there's not that many kangaroos and things like that out in the system. So a lot of our mammalian predators and even some of our reptile predators, rodents is they're sort of one of the key food sources. So the more rodents we had, the more feral cats we had. There's also this sort of negative interaction with our feral cats and red foxes. Dingoes, even though they're quite much larger, they disproportionately eat a lot of rodents in the system. So the more rodents about, the more food for them as well. But then things got a little bit crazy in a way. So things started to change with our dingo and introduced predator interactions when you started to take into account the phase that the system was in. So whether it was in a boom or a bust phase. So when things were booming, when there was plenty of resources, plenty of food, dingoes didn't seem to have much an effect on regulating feral cat and fox numbers. But as we started to get back into the bust phase of things, when food was getting scarce, that's when things got interesting and they started to regulate cat and fox numbers in a negative way. So the order of sort of how top-down effects from predators and bottom-up effects from resource pulses and rainfall, it's not fixed, it switches and it changes direction depending on what phase the system is in, which was quite surprising, but it also shows it was a lot more dynamic than we had first thought. So we grabbed this structural equation model. We went, all right, we've developed this model now. Let's make some projections from it. We know rainfall has increased by about 4 mils per year based on the previous work that I showed you. And the fire return levels are probably going to change as a consequence. So let's change them from 21 years to every 10 years. And let's feed that into this model and see what happens. So we changed our rainfall in years since fire. We fed it up into spinifex to see what spinifex cover would do, the resulting effect on spinifex seed, then how rodents would respond. We then ran the model without our introduced predators, the cats and the foxes. We also ran it just without any of the mammalian predators as well, just to see what would happen. So for spinifex cover, we saw this sort of general decline over time. So that increase in rainfall didn't really offset the increase in the fire return intervals as a consequence. So that sort of made sense. As a consequence, spinifex seeding and how we measure it declined as well. So the clumps are basically, the plants are getting smaller and they're not able to produce as much seed. So that kind of followed. But then things got a little bit crazy again when we looked at what was going to go on with the rodents, and somewhat unexpected in a way, in that if you go to the figure on the bottom and read from the bottom up, the black straight line is basically the model which we had all our mammalian predators in here still. We still had our cats, our foxes, and our dingoes. But our seed is falling. But the rodents didn't seem to respond much at all. When we removed all the predators, we got a bit of a jump, as you would kind of expect. You're releasing them from predation. But then when we reran the model and we just removed the introduced predators, we got an even greater increase in the potential population that could occur out there. So the dingo was providing this extra structuring of the system that was benefiting the rodents. And that's a bit counterintuitive because even though their food is declining, the effect of introduced predators is still so great that it was still suppressing the rodent populations, not really letting them reach their sort of potential full population levels. And the dingo just aided this population response even further. So I wanted to change tact now, I guess, and move from sort of stuff that I've done in the past to the different things that we've started up more recently since 2019. And the first example I wanted to talk through is something called DigiFarm. And this is out on a university-owned farm called Lara up in Narrabri. And we're one component of a larger project looking at digital agriculture. But our component's basically digital biodiversity, where we're trying to develop a remote sensor network across farms that could be deployed and rolled out across many farms. And that can be deployed across different habitats within our sort of agricultural landscape. And first work out what wildlife is on the farms, how are they using the farms, where do they live, and then how do farm activities influence their dynamics, and likewise, can they have influences on what goes on the farm and particularly around production? And that's I guess the longer term goal. So what we've done is we've set up 20 plots across Lara. Lara is basically inside this blue line. And we've kind of defined there's 3 broad habitats on the property. There's what we call the forest up on the hill here. We've then got the cropping country. So it's predominantly a cropping area with a little bit of cattle grazing. And then the area that's not used for cropping, what's left over, which often follows the drainage, is what we've deemed pasture. This is where cattle often run, and up on the hill here. So this is an interesting mix of pasture improvement, native grasslands, and down on the flats around the drainage, there's also a bit open forest. So it's quite a nice environment in there. And here's Glenda downloading some data from one of our fancy plots. So what we've done, each plot is a star picket on the ground, and we've attached 3 different devices to it. So working from the bottom up, the white device is an acoustic recorder that records in the audible range. So it's recording anything that we can hear. In the middle is what's called an anabat, and it records, again, it's an acoustic recorder, but it records in the ultrasonic. So it's targeting bats. An example of what that might look like is in the bottom spectrogram figure. At the very top is a remote camera trap. And you'll see that we use a lot of remote camera traps nowadays in ecology. And here's an example of a photograph of fox from the forest environment walking past the camera, getting its photo taken. So the anabat in the middle is set up in 20 of the plot, 12 of the 20 of the plots, and the other, all plots have at least a camera and a general acoustic device on it as well. So moving to the acoustic data, the audible data that we kind of have called our bird data set, but it does pick up insects, and it does pick up, if there's frogs calling and things like that, but we affectionately call it our bird data set. And we've got well over 42,000 hours of data now. And traditionally what we would do, so these devices, they record a 10-minute audio file every hour, every day. And what you traditionally would do is you would literally sit down with a cup of coffee or something stronger and listen to each recording and manually go through and identify everything that's calling. You can see that would probably get pretty tedious very quickly, and that, who has 42,000 hours up their sleeve to spare? So what we're doing is we're investigating the utility of using this new field called Ecoacoustics to derive some indices around biodiversity that can be quickly reported and quickly give us a snapshot of what's happening on the farm. So these traces here are some examples of these acoustic indices. There's been quite a few developed, but basically what they do is they look at the spectrogram, they look at your recording, and they try and work out what the diversity of calls within that recording is and the abundance of calls. And these particular figures here are basically the daily results coming off our plots. So each sort of day, every hour has been pulled up to a day across our 3 different habitat types. And when this data first started rolling in, it was quite exciting because instantly we could start to pick up differences amongst our habitats. So we don't know how sensitive these indices are, but at least we know they're sensitive enough to pick up habitat differences as well. And I'll go a bit more into that soon. The other thing I guess worth pointing out too is these indices are fairly new and they need to be validated as well. Like if you're using an indice, so the top one here is ADI, which is the Acoustic Diversity Index. The one in the middle is the Bioacoustic Index, which is a measure of the abundance of things calling. So the top is diversity, the one in the middle is the abundance. And then the one below, I find interesting, it's a ratio of natural to human-made sounds. So when that ratio is above 0, it's dominated by natural sounds. When it's below 0, it's dominated by human sounds. So this has lots of potential for fragmentation studies, but also thought it'd be pretty useful for on-farm studies too, as tractors are driving around and all that type of stuff. But that's all well and good. Do they actually represent diversity? Do they actually represent abundance? And so we've had some clever students come through and listen to some calls or subset of calls and try and validate these indices. And it turns out that they're pretty consistent with what they say they can do. So the diversity, the Acoustic Diversity Index, the ADI index, is giving us some sort of measure of diversity, and the Bioacoustic Index is giving us some sort of measure of the abundance of calls within that 10-minute recording, which is great because it's a lot easier to run this through the HPC than to sit there for 42,000 hours and listen to calls. So now that we're starting to develop this data set, and you might have seen some of this data being used in some DARE presentations from our students. I think Travis has been leading for us. We also, so these are just generalized linear mixed models. starting to tease out some of the patterns. So this is basic data pulled to each month. And we're looking at our 3 different habitats, our cropping, our forest, and our pasture. And just out of interest, this is an example of what a spectrogram might look like in the bottom right. And so we're pulling out these habitat differences, and we're also pulling out the seasonal changes that just naturally occur in the soundscape as well. So, you know, I mean, spring, summer, there's a lot more calling, a lot more birds, a lot more insects. When you start going to winter and stuff, things start to drop off and not call as much. So we're able to pick up those patterns, so that's good. But we're able to pick up more subtle patterns as well. There's switches too in the habitat. So, you know, sometimes cropping is just as abundant or even just as diverse in the soundscape and the thing is calling as some of the other habitats. And so there's this month and habitat interaction going on. So this has given us quite a lot of hope that these indices are actually more sensitive than we first thought. The other thing that we're sort of delving into now, and Glenys is doing honours with us at the moment, is also looking at the utility of deploying some machine learning models over some of our acoustic data. So she, amongst other things, is trialing BirdNet, which is developed by Cornell University. I think it's trained about 6,000 to ID 6,000 bird calls, but in our region, and that's worldwide, in our region, I think it does about 130 out of the 160 that might occur. So it's not too bad, but not perfect. So Glenys is trialing this over a subset of the data and pulling out and IDing individual species. And then she's going to go through and validate this. So this could be another way of starting to get some great biodiversity level and species level data. She'll also compare this to traditional just listening techniques and also to the ecoacoustics as well to see how all these different measures compare with each other. So moving to the bats. So this is an example from December 2020, but it's pretty sort of typical of bats, what we're finding with the bats within the warmer months of the year. They slow down a bit in winter. So each here is a map of Lara, color-coded by the different habitats. Each point is scaled by how many calls the acoustic device recorded. So there's a lot of, think about autocorrelation problems there, could be the same bat. But one of the first things that jumped out when we started to get this information back was the diversity of microbats, basically, that have been calling across the property. So Department of Primary Industry has a machine learning algorithm that could go through and pick out species or species groups. So that's why we've got some of these groups that have been combined. The calls are too similar to separate. It's a fairly old system, and there's a lot of scope to improve that system now. But for able to process this data in a timely manner, we found it quite useful. So we end up with this quite diverse area of bats on this property. And what's interesting about this community of bats is that further up the road, there was a study which basically found the same bat community, but they also found when they looked at their diets that they were disproportionately feeding on a particular pest. It was a moth that affects cotton and dryland cotton. So there's some really exciting avenues to pursue here, where if we can promote this community of bats on property and surrounding properties, they could be acting as essentially a free pest service for agriculture. The more pests they eat, the less pesticides you need to use, and that affects your bottom line straight away. So there could be actually monetary sense to start preserving some of the habitats and promoting some habitat for some of these critters, which is be an ultimate goal for our work on DigiFarm. And there's more if you're keen to see ABC Catalyst ran a bit on this story. Our remote camera traps too, just an example from what we're finding here. And again, the example I'm pulling out here is around pest species. It's very, I guess, useful for on-ground management, both across agriculture and ecology. But with this network of cameras set up, now we can find out where cats, foxes, and pigs in this case, where they're using the properties. And that can be used to direct your control campaigns. We also, because each photograph has a timestamp, we know when they're most active as well. So if you're really keen, you can look at, I'm going to go control pigs. I'm going to send a shooter out. I know which corner of the property at what time is going to be best to get the most pigs. There's also revealed that the farm is quite diverse as well. We've recorded 34 species so far. So I've talked a lot about mostly the vertebrates, but we're also started some work looking at the vegetation too, and in particular the grasslands. So this study is led by Elise van Hoven. And what we're doing here is imagine every sort of farm operation on a micro scale manipulating a vegetation plot. So what we're interested here, we've called this project DroughtNet. It feeds into some international networks that are doing similar work manipulating drought. What we want to know is how extreme rainfall, nutrient additions, so fertilizers, and grazing, which is predominantly cattle, how that influences the composition of our grassland species. And then if we can, then once knowing that, can we identify species that are really essential for this grassland system to function, but also that are going to be really useful to increase capacity for these systems to recover after disturbance events. So what we've done here is, somewhat ironically given the conditions, is we've created a 1 in 100 year drought using these rainout shelters. So imagine it's a double carport that leaks. It lets in just enough rain to simulate this drought. The water it catches then feeds into some water tanks, and we're using that to irrigate plots. So at the same time we're trying to create a drought, we're also trying to increase and make an extreme rainfall event as well, and that's piped to different plots as well. In addition to that, we're also adding the nutrients and grazing as well, and all of this is cross-factored. And then what we do is we go out and we do some vegetation surveys, identify the various species that are in the plots, and also do some biomass harvests as well. How many grams of each species of each group is grown in our plots, and we'll track that over time as the manipulations roll out. So it's one of these sort of classic split plot designs. There's six of these blocks. So we've got our control treatments, where basically it's open, it's to the ambient conditions. It just gets whatever rain falls. There's no manipulation going on rainfall. But we are manipulating the fertilizer, the nutrients, so the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. We are grazing, and we are grazing and adding nutrients at the same time. And then we're also doing that to our irrigated plots, and then also our drought plots too. Our drought plots are a little bit smaller. They're 8 by 8 meters, basically, because a 16 by 16 meter carport is quite expensive. We went to an 8 by 8. Underneath here is an image taken from a drone with a hyperspectral camera. This is courtesy of Dave Gallagher. It shows basically all our 6 plots. It's looking at the greenest values. And I've just pulled out what we call block 1 here to show that after some fertilizer addition, you can already see a response to the grassland. So these little plots here, these little squares that are turned bright green, are where the nutrients have been added. So they correspond to these 2 up here and these 2 over here. And you can't quite see the nutrient additions so much under the drought shelters, but you can see the outline of where the drought shelters are there. So there's some really exciting data sets coming off now, which would be really, watch this space, I guess. It'd be really cool to see. So turning to another example, and this is of the megafires that we experienced recently. They were huge areas, and this sort of animation here is just sort of putting, this is the Greater Blue Mountains area, and it's looking at all the large fires since I could find records. And it sort of shows the last big fire event in relation to all the other large fire events that we've had in the past. And it really put into perspective the area that that was burnt during these megafires. And in fact, when you look at this more broadly across the whole megafire area, across the East Coast forests, Michelle Ward led this work. When you start overlaying species distributions to the broader distribution of the fire scar, there was a potential for a 14% increase in threatened fauna species alone from this fire event. So this spawned the need for doing some rapid field surveys after the fire events. And this was confounded by COVID. COVID kicked in, lockdowns kicked in. So it's really hampered gaining that initial information after the fires came through, but we eventually were able to get out pretty much the summer after the megafires. And the local council up in the Blue Mountains funded this, where we did a survey looking at the relative abundance of vertebrates in burnt and unburnt reserves. And by burnt, we just stuck to burnt high severity burns. Then we also were interested in the species that we do detect across these burnt and unburnt landscapes. Are there any changes in how the temporal activity of the species, how they divide up their day? And it also gave us an opportunity to pilot ecoacoustics in this environment as well. Can we take our learnings from DigiFarm and use ecoacoustics to for post-fire assessments going forward? So we just had over about 22 remote camera traps, and here's Emma Spencer setting up one of the traps on the cameras, and they were set up along basically animal trails. And about 12 of those sites, we also had acoustic recorders put out as well. So all up, you pull all those cameras together, it was about 2,000 active camera trap days, which yielded 110,000 images, of which about 9,500 of those photographs had an animal. Out of that, we then deemed there was about 1,300 independent images. I could go into how we did that later. We still detected 41 species, which was pretty good. And interestingly, we didn't find any real difference in the species richness between upburnt and unburnt areas. But when you started to break things down by species, differences started to appear. So there were some species like the cats, the common blackbird, basing thrush, and small mammals that were disproportionately found more in the unburnt areas compared to our burnt reserves. Conversely, we had other species like the wombat, the magpies, the eastern grey kangaroos that turned up in the burnt reserves more than the unburnt reserves. And remember, this is a year after the fires have come through too. And remember, and the fires were put out by an extreme rainfall event. We also had species that didn't really care whether it was burnt or unburnt. So the red fox was moving across this landscape, didn't mind. And interestingly, the superb lyrebird also turned up in equal numbers of photographs anyway, in our burnt and unburnt reserves. And this was relieving in some respects, because this is a species of concern and that we're looking out for. But again, it's only a year after the fires. When you take all the timestamps out of these photographs, you can pull together and look at how an animal uses the course of a 24-hour period. So these are just density plots, like histograms, how many photographs were taken each hour. And you get an insight of how an animal divides up its time during the day. And then we split this up based on burnt and unburnt reserves as a consequence. And the short story here is like, for the cat, we didn't really find many in any burnt reserves, so it's not much of a story there. But for the other species, there was always a subtle shifts in how they were using a burnt landscape compared to an unburnt landscape, and when they were most active as well. So they were learning to live with the environment, but they do it in different ways. Interestingly, looking at the red fox and small mammals together, it was almost like the red fox here was sort of shifting its activity times to match whatever the small mammals were doing across our burnt and unburnt too. And it's a lot easier to hunt after it's burnt as well. It's not as much vegetation to hide in, as this fox found out. For our ecoacoustic indices, the first couple of months of the study didn't reveal anything going on. And it just happened that there was a mass cicada emergence at the same time. And the cicadas don't care if it was burnt or unburnt, they're underground. They all came out. If you traveled through the Blue Mountains at this time, you would have been sent home deaf because it was just so loud, and they pretty much neutralized the burnt unburnt areas. It all sounded like the Mars Devil was calling. As the Mars Devil eruption dropped away, as the months cooled away, differences started to emerge in our indices. So working from left to right, the diversity of calls within our unburnt was higher than our burnt reserves. The abundance was higher once the cicadas moved on in our unburnt reserves, but also followed that decline as you're coming into autumn, and you see that natural sort of decline in how many things are calling. And interestingly, the NDSI index, which is that natural sound to human sound, it was higher in our unburnt compared to our burnt. So it's all still above 0. So it's all positive in terms of more natural sounds, which you would hope in a bushland reserve. But it seems that the human sounds were sort of permeating further into the burnt areas than what they could in the unburnt areas, which kind of makes sense. There's not as much foliage, not much vegetation to block the sound. So it's showing some promise. So as a consequence, this has spawned some more projects. So now we've gone from about 22 camera sites to 92 scattered across the Blue Mountains National Park. I've got 2 wonderful students that are building on this previous work that we've done. And also now the design is stratified based on different levels of fire severity and fire history as well. The climate is supposed to be changing. Fire is supposed to get more severe, more frequent. So we've designed a study to try and capture what would the communities look like in those sort of circumstances. And we've also just recently got a little bit of funding to expand the acoustic work as well. And so we'll be rolling out some acoustic recorders, hopefully this summer as well. So we've got lots of photos, and a hat tip to, I can see Gordon and Henry was online. These guys have been working, we've been working together trying to train up some machine learning models to try and deal with all these photographs that are going to come in. And it's looking really promising and really exciting as well. And so we can talk about that a bit more if need be, but I'm just noting the time. Oh. So hopefully I kind of, I haven't shown any equations. Hopefully I've just sort of shown what a life of a field ecologist, how our data sets can be quite limited at times. We end up with a lot of missing values because the field happens, and there's some examples of different fieldwork fails that people have had. We need to do a better job in incorporating our missing values, quantifying uncertainty. So the ecosystem model I showed you, we really need to work out and do a better job of quantifying the uncertainty through each of the trophic levels. We're changing methods, we're changing technology. How can we account for that? Building better spatial temporal models is needed. And there's so much scope there for machine learning and image recognition and call recognition as well. And Australia's been fairly neglected in that sort of space as well. So I just want to stop there, and lots of people to thank, and thank all my wonderful collaborators and students.